Aloha and good morning. My name is Joe Viola. I'm with Regulatory Affairs with the Hawaiian Electric Company. And our panel will be exploring how utilities are focusing on the more than traditional utility operations to sustain and grow as a viable business. What does the future utility business model look like, and how does the customer fit in? And we'll consider whether changes in the regulatory environment are necessary, and what role does the investment community play in the utilities of the future. And to discuss these topics, we have a very distinguished panel. We first introduce Commissioner Lorraine Akiba. Commissioner Akiba was appointed to the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission in January 2012 by Governor Neil Abercrombie. Her current term extends through June of 2018. Prior to her appointment, Commissioner Akiba worked in private practice with the law firm of McCorston, Miller, Mukai, and McKinnon, and also at Cade, Schutte, Fleming, and Wright, where she headed the environmental practice groups at both firms with an emphasis in environmental and natural resource law and commercial and business litigation. Commissioner Akiba also served previously as the director of the State of Hawaii Department of Labor and Industrial Relations and chair of the State of Hawaii Environmental Council. She is currently a member of the Advisory Council to the Board of Directors for the Electric Power Research Institute, and she also currently serves on the Board of Directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. She received her law degree from the University of California, Hastings College of the Law, and her graduated with honors from the University of California at Berkeley. Next, we have Mr. Kyle Data. Kyle is a general partner of Ulupono Initiative, a Hawaii-focused for-profit impact investment firm that is working to improve the quality of life in Hawaii through sustainable investments in three key areas: locally produced food, renewable energy, and waste reduction. Previously, Mr. Data was CEO of U.S. Biodiesel Group, also a managing director of the Research and Consulting at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and a vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton. Mr. Data has earned his master's degree in public and private management from the Yale School of Organization and Management, and a master's degree in environmental science and resource economics from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Mr. Data serves on the board of directors for Blue Planet Foundation, Hawaii Bioenergy, and Parker Ranch. Next we have Rhea Salter. Rhea is a senior utility advocate at the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC. At NRDC, she focuses on development of utility business models and policies that promote the decarbonization of the electric grid. She also works to increase the deployment of clean energy in urban environments with a focus on the low-income sector. Before joining NRDC, Rhea was an attorney for the Environmental Defense Fund and also an attorney in private practice. She received her law degree from Fordham Law School and a BA in economics from Wesleyan University, and is also an adjunct professor at the Fordham Law School. And finally, we have Jim Alberts. Jim is a senior vice president of customer service with the Hawaiian Electric Company. He's been with the company since 2012. And he has more than 20 years of utility experience working with Kansas City Power and Light and Aquila. During his career, Jim has led and designed and implemented programs that focused on establishing top quality customer service and efficiency. While at Kansas City Power and Light and Aquila, as Vice President of Customer Service, he was responsible for all customer contact channels, customer relations, quality assurance, and billing matters. Jim is also a Lean Six Sigma deployment champion and a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt. He serves on the board of, he's a board member for Hospice Hawaii, and Jim received his business administration degree at the Minnesota State University and a master's in business administration from Drake University. So thank you, panel members. So with that, we'll turn it over. We'll ask for some initial comments starting with Commissioner Akiba. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Unfortunately, my slides didn't make it here with me today, maybe because it was the state holiday, Prince Kuhio Day, but we will have them available and make them available to the conference organizers so you can have them, I think, when you access their website after the conference is over. But basically, what I was going to talk about was HCEI, the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative 2.0, and what we're talking about here, the changing regulatory compact, and what I like to term as Utility 3.0, because hopefully the utility transformation that we're all going to be talking about on the panel today will be, at the forefront of what's happening, not only, in the United States, but also globally as well. You've all heard me talk about what I think are really the 4 R's in this next period of time. Why the transformation is so important is because HCEI 2.0, as was demonstrated by yesterday's panels in terms of the vision for the future, that the 4 R's are renewable energy on a reliable grid in a realistic time frame and at reasonable rates. And in order to achieve the 4 R's, we need to have a transformation of both the regulatory compact and also how the utility does business. And that includes engaging customers and making customers a dynamic part of that transformation process. So for me, if I were to sum it up in 2 takeaway points, the utility of the future, in my view, will be more about a utility that provides customers with energy services and managing those energy services to provide customer choice and customer empowerment. And customers are very active partners in that utility transformation, and therefore, because they are active partners, they stay engaged with the utility, they stay connected to the grid, and they provide not only value to help support the grid, but are recognized for the value of whatever, if it's distributed energy resources that they provide to the grid. Now, as you all know, Hawaii is being recognized across the country along with 2 sister commissions. I mean, our own Public Utilities Commission in Hawaii, we issued some very seminal orders last year, I think, near this same time in terms of the Maui Energy Conference, but we issued very seminal orders that set the tone, and we put forward a white paper that was called The Inclinations of the Future Utilities for Hawaii, where we outlined a strategic roadmap to help with the transformation of utilities in our state. And I think DBED Director Luis Oliveira said it very, very appropriately in his opening keynote remarks today. Policy without vision does not facilitate innovation. So I think I can confidently say that what we tried to do in the white paper was to provide that vision, that strategic roadmap to basically try to give guidance to our utilities in terms of what they need to do to align new utility business models with customers' changing expectations and state energy policy. We provided specific guidance for future energy planning and review, including strategic direction for capital investments in the integrated grid of the future. Now, that effort came out of some very informed work, and I want to thank, and many of you are in the room today, a stakeholder group that was involved in our Reliability Standards Working Group, where we adopted recommendations from that RSWG working group and final work product for integrating both utility scale and renewable distributed energy resources into a reliable and cost-effective grid. And we gave specific directions to lower energy costs, to improve system reliability, and to address emerging challenges to integrate additional renewable energy onto the grid. We also gave another order that set forth a policy statement regarding demand response programs, which, today's theme is how do we get customers engaged and give customers a role in the transformation of the grid. Well, through demand response programs, you heard from the earlier panel about energy efficiency, helping customers be very smart about how they use energy in the home, but also demand response, the customers through projects like Jump Smart Maui can be an active component of demand response programs that provide support to the grid, that help the grid operators integrate even more renewable energy onto the grids of the future. And we gave specific guidance to the utilities concerning the objectives and goals for demand response programs as distributed energy resources to be used by the utilities as generation resources. And for that, we were recognized across the country because in many jurisdictions, there's this debate like, does demand response really, is it really a part of a generation toolkit? And we specifically said in our inclinations, in our white paper, in our orders, energy efficiency, demand response, and energy storage are all generation resources, and they're to be used as generation resources and to be planned for in going forward in transformation of the grid. And we required an integrated demand response portfolio that will enhance system operations and reduce costs to customers and also make customers active partners. So With that said, I think I want to leave you there and leave some more time for some of my fellow panelists to give you kind of an intro. But I think we are well positioned with some of the strategic guidance and with the work of the industry stakeholders that are in the audience and the customers that we have to engage in this process. We will make the changes that we need to make, both in the regulatory models, in the business models, and actions to help customers be part of the solution and part of the implementation of transformation.
Thank you. Kyle, before you go, I'm sorry, we're encouraging participation from the audience by submitting questions. So if you can actually start thinking of some questions now, and I know write them down, and so that when the panelists are finished, we can jump right to your questions. So thank you. With that, Kyle.
Do I?
Yep. Right side. Yep.
Well, aloha, everyone, and good morning. As I've listened to our utility executives and their customers debate the future direction of the industry, I realize that we're all standing on the crossroads between the future and the past and unsure of which way to go. Do we stay with the business model we know well and keep the regulatory compact largely as is and decarbonize our energy mix? As I listen between the lines, that's sort of what I'm hearing from Alan and Eric when they talk about what that vision is. Or do we change the utility business model and embrace the technology choices that customers are making and realign the regulatory compact to this new reality? And that's the hard choice that I think we're facing. And to understand which way do we go, I think we need to understand how do we get here as Hawaii in sort of that historical context. So if you're going to bear with me, I'm going to take a few minutes to take you all through that and then discuss the choices we face and what we'll need to overcome to achieve our collective destiny. So it starts with the principles of modern regulation, which were actually laid out by Bondbright in 1960, and they're straightforward. Keep the utility viable, provide safe, reliable power, fair apportionment of the cost of service, promote economic efficiency, and be tariffs understandable to the public and feasible to apply. And this has been the bedrock of utility regulation and the regulatory compact for 50 years now. But these principles were not meant to guarantee a return. They were meant to give the utility an opportunity to earn a return. And the rates were meant to be non-discriminatory, not perfectly fair. So those are important distinctions in how they really apply. Then, if you flash forward to from 1978 through really 2005, the federal government stepped in and created a series of laws that were all meant to create wholesale competition. You had PURPA in 1978, EPACT of 1992, and that really expanded and created wholesale competition as we know it today. EPACT of 2005 actually mandated alignment between federal and state energy policy, particularly with respect to cleaner power, and promoted innovation, particularly in respect to renewables. And it's worth noting that it's from that act that required all the state commissions to look at the federal net metering approach, and in fact, 43 states adopted it. That's why we're here today. And largely, that was successful in achieving those goals. But since 2010, we've seen a fundamental technology shift that has made distributed generation more competitive and empowering to the customers than ever before. And this has caused some in the utility industry to fear a death spiral, while others have looked at this and said, this is a great business opportunity. But the technological shift requires fundamental changes in the relationship between the utility and its customer, and that calls for an additional regulatory principle, which is utilities must compensate the customers for the net value they provide to the system and require them to pay for the services used to the system. And so one of the questions we're going to have for the panelists today and to my colleague Jim is whether HECO agrees with this principle, because this also underlies a lot of the discussions that we're really having here today and how this ties back into honoring the principles of fairness, but recognizing the changes in technology. The other thing to recognize is that these principles then form regulations and become regulatory compacts that are co-evolved with the business model of the industry during those times. And the regulatory compacts actually changed several times over the last 50 years, and now we're at the stage of another change because of the underlying changes in the business model. And it's important to understand how Hawaii got to the regulatory compact that we're in today. So if you go back to Bond-Bright in 1960, the utility business model is based on capital expansion, and the focus was to acquire sufficient capital to build out the system for ever-increasing growth. That's why the compact had revenues based on cost of service. Shareholder incentives were based on return on capital, so that the more you built, the more you made. Tariff design was volumetric, made sense in increasing demand. Fairness was through rate classes. There was no competition. Innovation was all about economies of scale. And the system worked very well for about 20 years. And then right around 1978 to 1980, there were a series of nuclear fiascos where the massive cost overruns were ultimately shared between ratepayers and shareholders, and it caused a change in the regulatory compact. The regulators said, wait a second, maybe you shouldn't be the only ones building it. That's exactly what happened. So from 1990 to 2005, the business model changed. It changed to have competition at the wholesale level, and the utility business model adopted those changes. It didn't come easily. It was actually very hard. It was first attempted to be accomplished through deregulation, and a failed attempt actually at deregulation, not just the wholesale, but also the retail level. And then when deregulation failed, restructuring followed. And when restructuring threatened the financial integrity of the utilities, again, the stranded costs were shared between the ratepayer and the shareholder. But the changes that the federal government pushed down to the states endured. In fact, the power markets, despite the California disaster, have largely endured, although retail markets have largely failed to endure. The energy policy accomplished significant environmental compliance during this period, particularly in SOx and NOx, and the intent was to create markets, but not just that. The intent of the wholesale level was to change the fuel mix to essentially cleaner and cheaper providers, and that's exactly what happened. So now we come to Hawaii and where we are today. And the Hawaii Regulatory Compact was actually formed by a lot of people in this room between, I would say, 2006 and 2010. It was based on a traditionally vertically integrated model, but with the expectation of constrained growth. And due to the expectation of lower energy demand, decoupling was deployed to provide certainty of utility revenues, but the incentives remained the same, largely return on capital from rate base. The rates remained volumetric. Fairness was still based on rate classes. The PUC demanded more competitive bidding for wholesale generation and allowed distributed generation to compete for both customers and wholesale power. Our emphasis was on renewables and efficiency, so we designed renewable portfolio standards that incorporated both, adopted net metering to launch the industry, and created a third-party efficiency utility. And the system has worked very well to date in terms of achieving its targets. And part of that bargain was that the risk of fuel would still remain to be passed through to the customers. And that was part of the whole risk allocation. So that was the regulatory compact and bargain that was struck and we're living with today. Now, based on the merger document, it would appear that NextEra and HECO want to keep this business model and compact, but eliminate net metering. And it doesn't really work like that. You can't take one piece of the compact out, change it, without looking at the whole thing. And the major benefits of the merger are predicated on keeping decoupling intact, but it doesn't work like that either. The regulators will define the regulatory compact, and the burden is on the merger applicants to define the net benefits that they provide to all of us. So the recognition that we're in a regulatory compact and there may have to be changes to it is something which we need to embrace collectively and understand how to move forward. When we move forward, the big question is how do we align shareholders, ratepayers, and energy policy? How can we change the incentives so that the utility can make more money providing the services the customers say they need rather than holding on to the assets the customers no longer want, and yet preserve the viability of the utility during the transition? And it seems, if you read the inclinations document, which I'm sure all of us have, there's some primary fundamentals about what's happening here. The primary business of the utility is shifting from selling a commodity, providing and managing an infrastructure service. There's lots of variance on this theme. If you follow the inclinations model, and go to more of a WIRESCO environment, the regulatory compact changes significantly, and Raya is going to talk a lot about what's happening in New York around that, so I'm not going to take anything away from that. But if you stay vertically integrated as a services platform, a system services platform, and you still have generation and you're still managing the grid, there's a lot of questions in terms of how do we work the regulatory compact. When do revenues shift from decoupling to more of a transition to some form of revenue cap and RIIO-like models? How do we take the incentive so that you need the incentive to build out the grid, build out some generation, but how do you change the totality incentive so that more of it comes from saving the customers money on their bill through the shared savings approach, which is really attacking the fuel side, and all the performance-based metrics in terms of the operations utility and its customer relationships. It means fundamental changes in tariff design because the equity issue is not about net metering, it's about the fact that fixed costs are in volumetric rates. So how do we have to put the fixed cost back to the fixed side, the variable cost back to the variable side? What balance makes sense without upsetting rate classes unduly? And ultimately, when combined with the two-way rate principle, I think we address the heart of the conflict around net metering and move into a different dimension. There are going to have to have some sort of exit charges, and we're going to raise the question of if we're really listening to the customer, then we may have to give them some form of choice, as in City of Austin, where they can choose to pay more on their bill for the hedge, because that's what they're doing with their pocketbooks today when they put on solar, or they can ask community solar to do it, or they can just check that box on the bill, and the utility will then build it out for them. The big issues are going to be how much of the utility own, can its affiliate or directly compete or build? How do we make sure competition is fair? How do we ensure interconnection access is fair and equitable? These are all the kinds of things we're going to have to address when you allow the utility to compete in the new decarbonized renewable space. And there's a lot of value to that, but there's a lot of value in understanding how to structure that, the rules. You're going to get innovation across 4 dimensions: the smart grid, integration of renewables, distributed architecture, and then customer services. And that's where the innovation focus will be. So this is just one example of the myriad of models that are possible, but this is the conversation that we need to have. So what's keeping us from having this conversation? Why can't we find our way forward? And I think it comes down to this single word: trust. Trust is the currency that's in short supply. We need to have conversations around decoupling, the PSIP, the DG, the merger, that are frank, open, and honest. You can't buy trust with lawyers, public relations firms, political or community contributions. Trust is so expensive because you have to earn it. All of us do. And trust is earned by all sides having the courage to tell the truth about our situation, not just part of it, so that we can have a shared understanding of the factual realities that we're facing and recognize that all these choices have trade-offs. We have to balance those trade-offs. Trust is going to be earned by laying out the regulatory principles that each of us believe in so we can have a fair and frank debate over those and choose the ones that have consensus as a society and what commitments are being made by the utility, the regulators, and the customers around these. Trust will be earned by having a clear understanding of the future plans of the energy infrastructure for power and transportation, electricity and gas. And for those in the room that believe the bonds of loyalty are more powerful than earning the trust of the community, I just have 2 words for you: Carlton Ching. And the observation is not about the merits of the man or the individual. It's about what we just saw about the struggle between those competing values. So trust will be built by open dialogue, and I hope this panel and this conference sets us on the path towards rebuilding trust between the utility and community so we can have the dialogues and find our way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Raya?
My name is Raya Salter. I'm attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. It is my distinct pleasure to come all the way from the Big Apple to this beautiful island to tell you guys about truly the energy revolution that's underway in New York. Like the commissioner said, Hawaii is leading in utility reform, and New York State is right there with you guys. So I'm going to really just give a very brief overview, and then we'll spend some more time talking about these issues. So what's happening in New York, and how might this change this concept of a regulatory compact? So What is this energy revolution? Reforming the energy vision, also known as REV. What is this vision? I'll boil it down into two things. First is the creation of the utility as a distribution system platform provider. Think of this as an independent system operator on the distribution side, a platform that will enable the growth of distributed generation, distributed energy resources, as described by the commissioner. The second piece that's very important to this puzzle is the idea of animating, or at least in New York, is the idea of animating markets for DERs, the idea that we need more risk-based capital to invest and spur the grid modernization that's needed. So, where is this coming from? Who are our reformers? The point I want to make here is that this is something that's coming from the top. This is Governor Cuomo of New York, having empowered two distinguished members of the energy community, some of whom folks in this room may have met, namely our Public Service Commission Chair, Audrey Zibelman, former COO of PJM, co-founder of Veridity, and Mr. Richard Kaufman, our energy czar, former principal at Goldman Sachs, and a real believer in the power of private markets and capital and green finance. And I think that their fingerprints are all over the way this is coming together in New York. So why is the question? Why now? Why New York? Well, there are a lot of reasons. There are a myriad of reasons, historical and technological. One we discussed a lot is the issue of grid parity. Particularly solar is becoming less expensive and in relation to electricity, and there's more capacity for it. But again, I mentioned that this is top-down, so I'm going to say that there are two really big drivers. The first being rates and bills. We have the unfortunate distinction in New York of having the second highest residential electricity prices in the country after this esteemed company. And the pressure for those rates going up is not going away. We've got billions of dollars we need to invest and reinvest in the infrastructure, and this is something that's a phenomenon across the country. In addition, I think the other big driver is that Superstorm Sandy wreaked real havoc in New York, among other places, and there we really discovered that we were not ready, and not only were we not ready, but our utility was not ready. This is one of the more dramatic pictures of a completely black Manhattan, and it was Goldman Sachs that had invested in power quality, and our utility had not. It's true. So what is the other inspiration? I'll call it an inspiration for this reform. It's the way that Europe has been doing some thinking about changing the way they do their regulatory model. So I think that, and I won't get into the weeds of it now, but in the UK, starting around 2007, they started rethinking their regulatory model and had some of the same challenges and came out with some thoughts on how they can make the electric system more accountable by making it more forward-looking and asking the question, what are the public policy outcomes we want from our electric sector, and how can we incent the utility to achieve those? So the results of that, I think, have been very influential on this conversation as well. Here are our friends and colleagues. So hopefully you get to rub elbows with each other sometime in some context, perhaps another conference or NARUC. Con Edison, of course, has one of the most complex and unique electricity, gas, and steam distribution systems probably in the country. National Grid has a lot more experience with this changing utility model because they are a regulated utility in the United States and also in the UK. So let me talk just a little bit about what the process is for this energy revolution, how the Commission has decided to bring it together. So they're very interrelated, but the process going forward, They split it into 2 tracks, they called it. So the first track is looking at the broad policy goals and the implementation plan. On February 26th, we had a landmark order. It's extraordinary. I encourage people to take a look at it in that policy track. The second track is what they're calling the regulatory track. That's going to start this summer, and it involves the questions of regulatory reform. And that's where we're going to completely revisit the regulatory model and taking a new look at decoupling, net metering, and be looking at this UK framework, this RIIO framework, and this RPI-X framework, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about later. So I think that you can see that what is happening is that this is truly, in New York, a train that has left the station. Stakeholders and utilities need to get on this train, including environmental advocates like myself, or we will be left behind. So what about this idea of a regulatory compact? You know, is this an agreement written in stone between regulators and utilities because someone from, 300 years ago said that it is? I'll push back and say, there we go. I'll push back and say, I don't think so. I think what we're really talking about is more of a principle. I'm sharing the working definition from Professor Scott Hempling, who is brilliant, consider the source. He's a believer in third parties and non-utilities playing in the space. However, I think it's important to think about, because what is the expectation that government sets up for shareholders? And how do we fulfill that? And then just as important, what the regulator is doing in fulfilling that is based on the public interest and everything that entails. So I just mentioned the principle. So I think there will be some big near-term shifts to the changes that are happening in New York. And they'll happen both for the regulator and also for the customer. They're too numerous to really talk about now, and I don't want to go over time, but I'll mention a couple of them. First, if the utility becomes this distribution system platform or an independent system operator on the distribution side, does this mean that the regulation becomes thinner? And like the FERC sort of oversees the ISO, the regulator will perhaps step back from the distribution platform. That's something very interesting to think about. The regulators, as I think Kyle also managed, are necessarily going to have to spend more time regulating market power and competition and query how this will work as the tent expands, as we get more and more private actors providing more and more services, who will be regulated and how. Of course, though, another third piece that I'll mention in terms of the regulator in this system will have to spend a lot more time thinking about vulnerable customers and making sure that the goal of universal service and affordability happens for everyone, regardless of age, income, race, neighborhood vulnerability. So what about the customer? The customer will become both more invested in the system and also more independent from it. So I think that's an interesting development. Something I like to mention is that, in New York we talk about, the customer demand side management and the customer being a resource. But I feel like we have to be careful and watch that, because it's really the customer who should be demanding service and demanding choices. Yeah, I think another big question is, what's going to happen to rates and bills? So I will stop there.
Good morning, everybody. I think it's fair to say you've heard a lot over these past couple of days about utilities transforming and becoming an energy service provider. And I would agree with that. And I think it aligns pretty well with customer expectations, because customers tend to think about what that electricity is used for, not so much about buying kilowatt hours. So that's a transformation in and of itself, going from selling kilowatt hours to selling services. Now, customers in this model are at the center. We really have to think about those needs and how do we engage. So as we started this conference, we looked at a process that engaged many people and gathered their input. And I think that's a great way to begin the process and the dialogue. So we have to address all of these concerns from the customer point of view. And what I mean by that is looking at the whole life cycle of a customer experience with their energy provider. And that would include things like energy efficiency, demand response, all the financing options, electric vehicles, storage, pricing, distributed generation, community solar, and probably one of the biggest transformational issues is energy information and transparency. Now, we may not be the provider of all of these things, but those are all things that customers are going to care about in terms of making their choices. Now, there's a broad spectrum too. There will be customers in different segments. Some want to actively participate, some may not. And we're going to have to adapt to both. We're going to have to be able to serve both of those markets. The key point here is that we provide choices, options, and solutions, and help point out what those trade-offs are so people know what those alternatives mean to them personally. Now, a well-designed incentive-based regulation could be used in this model, but it has to be focused on the outcomes for customers. And if it's focused on that, and we all focus on what's right for customers, it's surely to be a winning strategy. But it also must be a collaborative process. Now, a couple of notes that I wrote down, and these are just details, but on the left-hand side, many things we've heard about over the past few days, it seems like we have some pretty common alignment on those, that everybody wants more cost-effective renewables and diversification to help manage risk. We want high reliability and resiliency, and we want lower bills, and we want more options. And we could make a long list there, and I think that's where we really have to start. We have to build on those things in common and work from that front. Now, the questions that are still out there, the way I think about this, is that these variables that manage this entire process all seem to be moving at a different pace. And if we work hard enough to get these issues on the table and move them together in a common set of steps and evaluate them properly, we'll make good decisions. Now, the proper incentives that align everything have to look at the long term, and I think in terms of best cost financing. Everybody wants certainty for their projects, whether it's a utility company that's building a large project or somebody who's putting a PV system on the roof. If you go give them a proposal or give us a proposal and it has lots of risk and lots of variability in it, the pricing for that financing is going to go up. So as we think about these projects, providing some certainty into those, the better the pricing for those alternatives. I think we also have to be willing to tolerate differentiated pricing. Now, time of use rates or dynamic pricing are the things that get talked about a lot. But for many, many years, it's been one size fits all. And we've probably become comfortable with that. So as we move forward, how do we, in a sense, mass customize rates and rate design to be able to fit customer lifestyles and choices? And then how do we evolve to a new model without total disruption? Because electricity is a fundamental service. It's not something that I think we can afford to take huge chances with because people rely on that service. So how do we provide for a smooth transition for both customers and the utility? So a couple final thoughts. Customers are really at the center of all the plans. We no longer sell kilowatt hours, but energy services on an integrated grid. And it's this integrated grid that creates many of the opportunities we've talked about the past couple of days. It allows us to incorporate a diverse set of renewables, whether it's wind power, geothermal, biodiesel. Wherever those resources can be deployed in an optimal location, the grid allows us to interact with those resources and put them where it can be used. Now, the transformation at Hawaiian Electric is an important step. And I've listed a couple of of initiatives here that we've heard about the past couple of days. The first one I wanted to take note of because it involves something Kyle talked about, which is trust. But how do we make and keep commitments? So in this notion of distributed energy resources, we set about a goal last October to clear our PV queue. And I'm proud to report today that on Maui Island, as Matt reported, that queue has been cleared. On Hawaii Island, that queue has been cleared. And on the island of Oahu, we're going to meet our target of clearing that queue greater than 90% of it by the end of April. So a lot of thought and a lot of collaboration went into that, and I think it's the alignment that made that happen. We saw the solar industry, the national labs, and other industry partners with inverter manufacturers come together to make that solution work. And working together, we're able to drive this outcome for customers. And I think that's what this story is all about. How do we, as an energy service community, come together to make that happen? So this alignment and the greater transparency allows everyone to move faster. But it's up to us to help outline and identify what those choices are, and then engage in the discussion. We can frame those choices, but then it's the discussion of how we bring it forward and help people make good choices, informed choices. Almost a no regrets philosophy, because the investments that we make are so long term that we really have to make it last. And then we really have to avoid unintended consequences. And I think a notion of social responsibility for a critical service like electricity is something we have to think about for all customers. So the programs we design, the things we implement as an energy service community have to be sustainable, and they have to be fair because they have to last. So with that, I'll turn it back to Joe.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, thank you to the audience members for submitting questions. So we have a little bit of time left. Let me start with the first one. It's addressed to Commissioner Akiba. And the question is, does the Commission have a plan or goals for converting transportation from fossil fuel to electricity?
Okay. Well, we don't directly regulate transportation, apart from motor carriers, but I think what we have said in terms of harnessing distributed energy resources in our white paper actually does touch upon transportation. We've said that the utilities should really work on actions to enable customer-sited distributed energy resources. Now, that includes harnessing these resources to benefit the system and customers. And we specifically said in our directive that, that the utilities should develop distributed generation interconnection plans, which are currently on a docket that's open. So I can't talk about the specifics of those plans other than what the guidance that we gave, which was to include distributed energy resources such as electric vehicles to provide support to the grid, to be a mechanism by which to integrate more renewables in the grid. And electric vehicles, by virtue of being an operational tool to help address overgeneration during the period from 10 to 2, the duck curve we've all talked about, politically correct load, while in a win-win, reducing fossil fuel consumption of gasoline for transportation vehicles. Electric vehicles, as you see from the Jump Smart Maui, I keep saying that because it's right there outside, in the lawn, is a very real-world, best-case example of that, where electric vehicles can be used as ancillary services to the grid, and perhaps in the future to be an energy storage mechanism to also help to provide resiliency and reliability to the home, as they do in Japan, where the electric vehicle can also discharge in times of intermittent disconnection due to some disturbances on the grid. So that is the future, the customer electric vehicles, transportation. We get a double win there, reducing fossil fuel consumption within the transportation sector. EVs then become a part and parcel of that, and in both sectors you see wins and benefits to our state.
Thank you. Let me open it up to the panel members, see if anyone else wants to add in. How can the regulatory model be adjusted, or should it be, to accommodate something like electronic vehicles?
I think there's really two questions to think about. One is, again, do you allow the utility to put these kinds of services into the rate base, I provide the backbone of these, at least in the public dimension. And secondly, what's the rate structure that you're going to use around the vehicle? So there will be a regulatory component for these charging stations, and it really has those two components. You know, who's allowed to play in them, and what are the rules around that, and what the pricing that anyone playing in them is going to offer.
I would add that certainly NRDC in New York has advocated, you know, that a big part of it is planning. We're talking about electrification of the transportation sector, you know, and we've advocated that, you know, the utilities be directed to begin to, you know, make plans about how they will achieve that. And we've also sought to promote and refine EV tariffs. So just in our advocacy.
Can I comment a little bit more about that? Just sharing knowledge from other jurisdictions. You know, and I think correctly pointed out, you know, New York is leading, you know, as we have in Hawaii, but also California, and that's where there's been a lot of electric vehicle deployment. Many of the utilities there, San Diego Gas and Electric for one, as an example, you know, vehicle to grid, and seeing that as a whole new revenue business opportunity for utilities. And I think we've discussed that here in Hawaii for all the utilities that whether the utility owns EV charging stations or works in partnership with third-party demand response aggregators who use EV charging stations as demand response tools to assist with ancillary services to the grid. Those are all new business models, potential new business opportunities and revenue opportunities for the utility of the future. And it's happening on both sides of the mainland, New York, California, and it's happening here in Hawaii. And I think we are the best cased living laboratory to really test out those models, because we have island grids, and you know we don't have competing jurisdictions like they do in New York with FERC and NERC and ISOs and RTOs. You know, we have a great opportunity here to be the test bed for innovation for the future, and I'm encouraged by that.
Thank you. Next question is for our guest from New York, for Raya. A couple questions here. Let's see. Who paid for the damage to the electrical system due to Superstorm Sandy? And then, should climate change be a consideration for rates?
Is that a trick question or a softball to the environmental advocate?
You have friends in the audience? Or did you write this?
But no, those are two very important questions. And I was involved to a certain extent in both rate cases in New Jersey with Public Service Electric and Gas, and also with Con Edison. After Superstorm Sandy, both utilities came forward with sort of rebuilding rate cases, for lack of a better term. Con Edison's, they actually went through, it was approved, and it was $1 billion plus for resiliency and redundancy and rebuilding. And Public Service Electric and Gas, I believe, just recently, literally, I think, days ago, settled or is close to settling theirs. And theirs was even more, I think, in the billions. So that's I think, the quick answer to that. Yes, we think that carbon pricing is important. And I think that the Commission in New York agrees. In fact, on the local level, because I represent NRDC in the New York docket, but also a low-income energy efficiency coalition. And we really were pushing for the Commission to get ahead of both environmental justice and like local emissions impacts. And the Commission recognized that and is requiring that local emissions impact rules be created, including environmental justice and emissions pricing. So yes, carbon pricing, we're excited about it. We think it's going to happen in some regard.
Thank you. Let me interpret one, but let me address this to Kyle first, and then see if Jim wants to respond on this. But Kyle, maybe we can start with how. Can you expand a little bit on how can shareholder and ratepayer interests be better aligned in the future?
Sure. So it's important to understand who the utility shareholders are. They're not everyday stock owners. They're typically pension funds, and they require a certain degree of certainty over the expectation of the utility's earnings. So that's what you're trying to align to, is the markets they're in, so that they can form the capital needed at low cost to actually build out the part of the system. So if you start from that premise, the alignment has to look at, for the shareholders, if you look at how the utilities incentives, whether it's from the old style of rate base or the new performance incentives, or the concept of, look, we're all trying to actually eliminate oil dependency, how do we share in their ability to source renewables or build renewables and share in that fuel savings, there has to be enough certainty in those revenues to still track that capital. The ratepayers, on the other hand, have to feel that that package that we're offering them aligns them to provide all the services at the level of quality they want. Performance-based incentives do that, as well as provide the degree of local resilience and local control over energy, which is really around the fuel mix and the rewards for putting in the right fuel mix. And then if you're a consumer advocate, say at the right price, which is around aligning with some sort of savings for beating the price that the Commission sets as a benchmark. So there's ways you can do alignment that will shift what the utility does today, but also benefit all the societal goals we have with both shareholders and ratepayers, while still honoring the fact that it's very unlikely the utility is going to change who buys their shares in the capital markets. That's not a likely outcome. So we have to recognize there's constraints here and honor those.
Thank you. Jim, I think both you and Kyle talked about actually common ground. Is there common ground between shareholders' interests and their customers?
Sure. So we all want more renewables. We want lower bills. We want our economies locally to be better. We want to be very competitive in the world. So I think if you start with those things, you build off of that, and you create the right structure with the right incentives in those ways, then it creates that proper alignment. And it has to have in the way I think about it, it has to have a meeting of the minds. Because when you sit down and have this discussion, you can talk about these issues, but then at some point you have to commit to it. And because these, like I said before, these are long-term investments and long-term strategies. So the notion that in our industry that things can just move really rapidly year to year, like the technology is moving, there has to be some certainty in this environment. So having that meeting of the minds, making commitments along the line of those things of no regret. And then there are things on the edges, the new technologies that are always coming in. Maybe there's a little different process for that, but creating this alignment amongst all the stakeholders is critical to our success.
Okay. Time for a few more. Let me see. Let me pose this I'm going to start it with Raya. How, if at all, will regulators' oversight of the utilities change in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I addressed it a little bit in my slides. If we're talking about the DSP model that's happening in New York and having more competitive actors, utility is going to have to, the Commission is going to have to think about how much they want to be in the weeds of the financial and business decisions that the utility makes. They may find themselves doing less of that and doing more, again, oversight of competition. And that's one of the things that came out of our last order in February, is that there's going to be new codes of conduct, and that there need to be updated codes of conduct and consumer protections and a whole host of other rules. I'll also say that potentially a helpful framework, I think, to think about the shifting regulatory compact, if that's how we want to call it, is I think has been said by a lot of folks throughout this conference, looking at public versus private ownership. Where's that balance? Are we still talking about a natural monopoly in a fully envisioned distributed generation or decentralized electric system? And what does that mean across the continuum? And the third, I think, is we talk about essential service, and we know electricity is an essential service, but also in a fully realized decentralized vision, does the customer have the same kind of dependence with technology changing? Do they have the same kind of dependence for this essential service? So these things are going to move on a continuum.
Anyone else?
I would just add one thing. I think the regulation part is one aspect of it, but the market design is the other side of it. So even making choices about simple things like where your locational value of your PV panels are and how we optimize those for the system as a whole, not necessarily each individual, but how do we optimize the system and how do we reward people and provide the right incentives in the market to be able to accomplish that rather than having to overspend and overbuild. How do we provide the right solutions in the market for people?
I agree with that.
Just a few minutes left, so concise answer for the final question, and that is, we've talked about change, and with change, oftentimes there are winners and losers. For customers, are there any particular challenges or things that our regulators need to look at for our customers or any particular segment of our customers? I'll open it up to anyone.
I'll start off. I think we have to make sure that we are making decisions and taking actions that take into consideration not all customers are alike, and so therefore we need to be cognizant of what we call, hard to reach customers and those who may not at this point be enabled to take advantage of the opportunities that are available for distributed generation, for distributed energy resources. We can't neglect the folks who are not able right now to have access to that. We have to make sure that we allow access and we are cognizant, and I think the consumer advocate is here in the front row, and that's part of his job and his office. Always make sure that we are keeping in mind those considerations. But I would like to point out, and I guess it's a segue for the after lunch panel, because I have to give our Chief Counsel Tom Gorak a shout out because he's chairing that panel, that in fact the Commission has looked at this and looked at mechanisms, and we are in fact being recognized again for customer programs to try to give new programs to give all customers access to renewable energy, to lower electricity costs through innovative financing mechanisms. And stay tuned, because after lunch I think they're going to talk about the on-bill financing program, which I think got recognition as one of the best practices for others to follow across the country. And the Stanford Hoover Institute of Clean Energy report called this policy a very, worthy of recognition and something that should be paid attention to. So something to keep in mind for the afternoon panel if you want to hear more about on-bill financing and some of the new things that we're doing to allow all customers to have access to the benefits of renewable energy and distributed energy resources and to be part of this transformation.
I would say amen to what she just said.
Hallelujah.
I'll just build on 2 points. We're a rural state, and we're not very wealthy by comparison in terms of our population, but we're blessed with a strong community, and that's the strength of our state. So on top of everything else that the Commission is doing, this bill around community solar will harness the power of that community to then share those resources in a way that will probably work for all ratepayers. So it's additive to the things Lorraine was saying. The other big class of customers that will be distinctly different in the future from the past that we have to think about are actually the very large prosumers. I mean, you heard from, Pontiela Power and Dutch as actually representing one class. I think if the military is up here, you'd hear from them as well. And they are going to have a profoundly different relationship with the utility than has ever been before, because they have the ability to, in fact, form their own grids, provide services inside those grids, and be complementary in terms of building reliability, resilience to the larger system they're part of. But that's a whole nother commercial discussion and negotiation about how to make that work for both parties. So there's another large class that is emerging from this technological shift.
Great. And then with that, I'm going to have to thank our panel members sincerely, thank the audience for providing great questions.
Thank you.